The Kidnapping of Jaycee Lee Dugard, 1991, USA, escape after 18-year abducted at 11, held captive. A small town and a simple life. In the early summer of 1991, South Lake Tahoe, California, looked like a postcard. Tucked away in the Sierra Nevada mountains, it was the kind of community where families felt safe. Children rode bikes in their neighborhoods, neighbors knew each other, and the towering pine trees gave the town a feeling of both seclusion and comfort. For Jaycee Lee Dugard, an 11-year-old girl with blonde hair, a shy smile, and a gentle personality, life felt relatively normal. She lived with her mother Terry Probin, her stepfather Carl, and her younger half-sister. Jaycee loved animals, especially cats, and she was known as a sweet, quiet girl who sometimes lacked confidence but always had kindness in her eyes. At this stage in her life, Jaycee was like any other 11-year-old. She worried about schoolwork, dreamed about pets, and thought about ordinary childhood things. She was looking forward to summer vacation, time to play outside, and lazy days with her friends. But beneath that everyday innocence, June 10, 1991, would become the darkest day in her family's history. That Monday started like most others. Jaycee got dressed for school at Myers Elementary. She put on her pink shirt and gray pants, and she carefully applied a bit of pink nail polish to her nails. Like many girls her age, she wanted to feel special that day. Something as small as wearing bright nail polish made her smile. Because the family home was located slightly uphill in a semi-rural area, Jaycee didn't ride the school bus from her front door. Instead, she walked about a quarter of a mile down the road to the bus stop. Her stepfather, Carl, often watched her leave and sometimes walked with her. That morning, however, he stayed home but watched her from the doorway as she made her way down the winding road. Jaycee's backpack was slung over her shoulder, her school books neatly packed. She walked the familiar route, breathing in the crisp Tahoe mountain air. It was a safe community. There was no reason for anyone to imagine that danger lurked nearby. But danger was waiting. As Jaycee approached the bus stop, a white car, later identified as a Mercury sedan, slowly rolled up beside her. Inside were Phillip Garrido, a convicted sex offender on parole, and his wife Nancy Garrido. Phillip was in his early 40s at the time. He had a long criminal history, including kidnapping and rape, and he was supposed to be under strict supervision. His wife Nancy was complicit in his fantasies and crimes. Together, they were hunting for a victim. Witnesses later described the car pulling up alongside Jaycee. Nancy rolled down the window, smiling in a false gesture of friendliness. In an instant, the situation turned dark. Nancy distracted Jaycee, possibly asking for directions or pretending to need help. As Jaycee leaned slightly closer, Phillip shocked her with a stun gun. The electric crackle filled the quiet morning, and Jaycee collapsed, her small body jolted by pain and confusion. Before she could scream, Phillip scooped her up and shoved her into the back seat of the car. Nancy quickly slammed the door shut. The entire attack lasted seconds. At the top of the hill, Jaycee's stepfather Carl saw something unusual. He spotted the white sedan near Jaycee. He saw her fall and the car speed away. His heart sank. Without hesitation, he jumped on his mountain bike and pedaled furiously, chasing the car down the road. But the car was too fast. It disappeared around a corner, leaving only the sound of tires against gravel and a trail of dust. Carl screamed, hoping someone nearby would help. His worst nightmare was unfolding in front of his eyes. Carl raced back home and shouted to Terry, Jaycee's mother, that someone had taken her. In disbelief, Terry grabbed the phone and called the police. Her voice was panicked, broken, almost incomprehensible, as she reported her daughter had just been kidnapped. Within minutes, patrol cars and officers from the El Dorado County Sheriff's Department swarmed the area. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Neighbors came out of their homes, shocked and scared. Some joined the search, scouring the woods and roadsides, hoping to catch a glimpse of the white sedan. But Jaycee was gone. News of the kidnapping spread quickly through South Lake Tahoe. Parents clutched their children tighter that night. Schools warned students about strangers. The once peaceful town was suddenly a place of fear. The FBI joined the investigation. Flyers with Jaycee's smiling face, pink shirt, blonde hair, bright eyes were posted on telephone poles, grocery stores, and gas stations. The media broadcast her photo nationwide, and her story touched hearts across the country. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, no trace of Jaycee was found. Witnesses only had vague descriptions of the car. The Garridos had vanished into the shadows, taking Jaycee with them to a place no one knew existed. For Terry, Jaycee's mother, the days after the kidnapping were a blur of grief and determination. She went on television, begging whoever had her daughter to return her safely. She cried in interviews, her voice trembling with both despair and hope. Every night, she kept Jaycee's room exactly as it had been, her favorite stuffed animals waiting, her bed neatly made. Terry refused to let go of hope, even when the investigation stalled. Her stepfather Carl, who felt the crushing guilt of not being able to save her, replayed the moment in his mind 1,000 times, the white sedan, the stun gun, the desperate chase on his bike. For years, he would carry that burden. The abduction of Jaycee Lee Dugard on June 10, 1991, was swift, brutal, and devastating. In less than 30 seconds, her life was stolen, her family shattered, and a community shaken. What no one knew then was that Jaycee had not vanished into thin air. She was hidden in plain sight in a backyard prison, less than 200 miles away, where she would remain for the next 18 years. The world would eventually learn her story. But on that day in 1991, all that was left was silence, fear, and the desperate hope that one little girl would be found alive. When Jaycee's small body went limp in the backseat of the white Mercury sedan, she drifted in and out of consciousness. Her head ached from the stun gun's impact. She barely understood what had just happened. The hum of the tires on the road mixed with muffled voices in the front seat. Nancy Garrido occasionally looked back, smiling in a strange, false attempt at reassurance. Phillip Garrido, with wild eyes and erratic speech, kept muttering about God's plan and a special purpose for Jaycee. At 11 years old, Jaycee could not comprehend what those words meant. All she knew was fear. The drive from South Lake Tahoe to Antioch, California took hours. Jaycee's family and police were already searching frantically, but she was being carried farther away from home with each passing minute. When they finally arrived, Jaycee's new world was revealed, a backyard prison, hidden behind Garrido's Antioch home. The property looked ordinary from the outside, but behind it was a maze of tents, sheds, and tarps fenced off from the neighbor's view. It was here that Jaycee would spend the next 18 years of her life. Phillip and Nancy led Jaycee to a small shed. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and dust. A single mattress was on the floor, surrounded by bare walls. There was no window, no way to see the outside world. As the door shut, Jaycee heard the click of a padlock. That sound would haunt her for years. It was the symbol of her captivity, the line between freedom and a nightmare she couldn't escape. At first, Jaycee believed her family would come for her any minute. Maybe the police were following. Maybe her stepdad was still on his bike, still chasing the car. She prayed someone would burst through the door. But the hours turned into days. And no one came. From the beginning, Phillip made it clear that he was in charge. He was unpredictable, sometimes speaking calmly about God, other times erupting with anger or slipping into strange ramblings. He told Jaycee she was special, that she was chosen. He wrapped his abuse in twisted spiritual language, making himself sound like a prophet instead of a predator. For a child, this was both terrifying and confusing. Nancy played the role of caretaker. She brought Jaycee food, sometimes a small toy, and acted like she wanted to comfort her. But she was also complicit. When Jaycee cried for her mother, Nancy did nothing. She stayed silent, turning away, as if to say, "This is your life now." In the first weeks, Jaycee missed everything. The sound of her mother's voice. The feel of her own bed. Her cat curling up beside her. She even missed school, her friends, and ordinary routine. She tried to mark the days in her head, but they blurred together. Morning and night looked the same in the dark shed. Sometimes Phillip would bring her outside for brief moments, but always within the confines of the backyard prison, never where neighbors could see. Jaycee found herself speaking out loud to herself, just to hear a voice. She imagined conversations with her mother. She pretended she was still at school, answering questions in class. These small coping mechanisms kept her sanity intact. While Jaycee was adjusting to her new horrifying reality, the world outside hadn't stopped searching. The FBI, local police, and volunteers were combing through South Lake Tahoe. Tips flooded in, sightings of a white car, reports of strange people, alleged kidnappings. But none led to Jaycee. The Garridos lived 170 miles away, in Antioch, a rundown neighborhood where parole officers occasionally checked in on Phillip. Astonishingly, despite his criminal record and history of sex crimes, no one searched the backyard. It was hidden well enough, and the system overlooked the obvious. This failure of law enforcement would later become one of the most controversial parts of Jaycee's case. By late 1991, Jaycee began to realize she wasn't going home anytime soon. She was still just a child, but she had to survive. She started doing small things to hold on to her identity. She thought about her favorite color, pink. She whispered her own name to herself before sleeping, afraid she might forget who she was. She created little stories in her head, daydreaming about reuniting with her mom. Phillip's abuse was ongoing, but Jaycee's will to survive was stronger. She developed an extraordinary ability, the power to endure, to live in the moment, and to adapt. For an 11-year-old, this was both heartbreaking and remarkable. Nancy was a strange figure in Jaycee's captivity. She sometimes brought her small comforts, a piece of candy, a blanket, but it was clear these were not acts of kindness. They were acts of control. Nancy wanted Jaycee dependent on her, to see her as a mother figure. She often told Jaycee not to cry, not to fight, because this is where you belong. For Jaycee, Nancy became both a jailer and a twisted caregiver. She wasn't the one using violence, but her participation made the captivity possible. Even in the darkest early years, Jaycee found moments of resilience. She began to write in secret, scribbling thoughts on scraps of paper whenever she could. She talked to stray cats that wandered near the backyard fence, seeing them as friends. When Phillip rambled about God or the voices in his head, Jaycee stayed quiet, nodding when necessary, learning how to avoid his anger. She became skilled at survival through silence. This ability to adapt, to find small ways to keep hope alive, would be what carried her through nearly 2 decades in captivity. By 1993, 2 years had passed since Jaycee was taken. She was no longer the 11-year-old girl who left for school on that June morning. She was now a teenager trapped in a twisted prison, forced to grow up in isolation. Her family still searched. Her mother still cried on TV, begging for her return. Posters with Jaycee's face were still up in parts of California. But no one knew she was alive, just beyond the fence in Antioch. And for Jaycee, the question that haunted her every night was, would she ever see her family again? By 1993, 2 years had passed since Jaycee was kidnapped. She was now entering her teenage years, a stage when most girls were thinking about middle school, friends, and growing independence. For Jaycee, though, that natural growth was happening behind walls of tarps, sheds, and secrecy. The world outside was moving on. Missing posters faded. News coverage slowed. The community of South Lake Tahoe had been shaken, but as time stretched, her case began to grow cold. For her mother Terry, life had become an endless cycle of grief and hope. She refused to believe her daughter was gone forever, but each passing year was like salt on an open wound. Meanwhile, Jaycee was adapting to a new, grim reality, a reality that demanded resilience far beyond her years. Phillip Garrido's control grew deeper as the years passed. He wasn't simply keeping Jaycee locked up, he was shaping her world, distorting her thoughts, and using his erratic mix of religion, drugs, and abuse to dominate her. Phillip often rambled about the voices he heard, voices he claimed came from God. He believed he was chosen, that his crimes were somehow part of a divine plan. To Jaycee, these rants were terrifying. She never knew when he might snap, or when his delusions might turn violent. Sometimes, he showered her with small tokens, a toy, a coloring book, or a treat, as if he wanted her to see him as a father figure. Other times, he subjected her to cruel abuse, both psychological and physical, reminding her she was his prisoner. Nancy reinforced this control. She positioned herself as the motherly caretaker but made sure Jaycee understood that escape was impossible. Nancy brought food, toiletries, and clothes, but also fear. She told Jaycee not to fight, not to resist. Her role was clear, to keep Jaycee compliant and invisible. As Jaycee grew older, Phillip's abuse escalated. Eventually, Jaycee became pregnant while still a child herself. This moment was devastating. Jaycee was terrified, unprepared, and completely isolated. There were no doctors, no family, no one to guide her. Nancy played the role of midwife when the time came, helping with the delivery inside the backyard compound. At just 14 years old, Jaycee gave birth to her first child, a little girl who became both her greatest burden and her greatest source of hope. For the first time since her abduction, Jaycee had someone else to protect, someone who depended on her entirely. Over the years, Jaycee gave birth to 2 daughters, both fathered by Phillip. These children were born into captivity, their entire world confined to sheds, tents, and the backyard maze Garrido had built. Jaycee did everything she could to give them love and a sense of normalcy, despite the circumstances. She taught them to read and write, using scraps of paper and books Garrido occasionally allowed. She made up games, stories, and activities to keep their minds active. The children grew up believing their world was normal. For years, they didn't know that life outside the compound existed. One of the most haunting aspects of Jaycee's captivity during these years was the number of missed opportunities for rescue. Phillip Garrido was a convicted sex offender on parole. This meant parole officers were supposed to monitor him closely. They visited his Antioch home multiple times over the years. Yet, incredibly, none of them discovered Jaycee or the hidden compound in the backyard. Neighbors occasionally grew suspicious. They reported strange activity, children they hadn't seen before, odd structures, tents, and tarps behind the house. Some even contacted authorities. But each time, the reports were dismissed or not followed up properly. The system failed Jaycee again and again. To survive, Jaycee built an inner world for herself. She kept journals when she could, writing down her feelings, her dreams, and her pain. In those pages, she clung to her identity. She reminded herself that she was still Jaycee, still her mother's daughter, still more than just a prisoner. She poured her love into her children, making them the center of her life. Protecting them became her mission. Even though they were products of her abuse, they gave her a reason to keep going. Her resilience was extraordinary. Most people, stripped of freedom for years, might have broken completely. But Jaycee adapted. She endured. She found ways to keep hope alive, even when hope seemed impossible. From 1993 to 2002, Jaycee's life remained hidden in the shadows. While her family longed for her return, while authorities overlooked crucial chances to rescue her, Jaycee was raising children in captivity, surviving one day at a time. The little girl who once painted her nails pink on the morning of her abduction was now a young mother, still imprisoned, still silenced, but unbroken. This lost decade would later become one of the most painful revelations of her story, that Jaycee was alive all along, trapped just behind the walls of a house that parole officers were supposed to be watching. The world didn't know it yet, but the chain of failures was setting the stage for her eventual discovery. By the early 2000s, Phillip Garrido was no longer just hiding his crimes, he was trying to reinvent himself in plain sight. On paper, he looked like a man trying to turn his life around. He attended church services, spoke to neighbors about God, and even started a small printing business. But behind the mask of normalcy was the same backyard prison. Jaycee, now a young woman in her mid to late 20s, remained under his complete control, raising two daughters who had never known freedom. Phillip was living a double life, on one side, a changed man trying to convince the world of his faith, on the other, a manipulative criminal keeping a family captive just beyond his fence line. Around this time, Garrido ran a small printing company out of his home. He called it Printing for Less and used it as both an income source and a way to interact with outsiders without raising suspicion. He sometimes brought Jaycee into the business, introducing her under a false name as an assistant. She was never allowed to reveal who she really was. This role gave Jaycee small glimpses of the outside world again. She saw clients, overheard conversations, and touched pieces of normal life, but always under Garrido's watchful eye. To those who met her, she seemed shy, quiet, and reserved. No one suspected she was a kidnapped girl living under an alias. Phillip's obsession with religion and his delusional belief in hearing voices intensified. He claimed God spoke directly to him, telling him he had a special mission. He began recording strange, rambling videos about religion, music, and his supposed ability to control sound with his mind. In some of these videos, Jaycee appeared not as herself, but as part of Garrido's bizarre projects. Neighbors described him as eccentric, odd, and overbearing, but still no one connected him to Jaycee's case. One of the most astonishing missed opportunities came from Garrido's repeated visits to the UC Berkeley campus. Obsessed with promoting his religious theories, he often showed up uninvited to talk to students and faculty. In 2006, he even delivered strange pamphlets and began rambling about his mission from God. His behavior was so unsettling that campus staff reported him. Yet, Despite his parole status and criminal past, the matter never escalated into a thorough investigation of his home. Jaycee, at times, accompanied him on these outings under a false identity. She played the part Garrido demanded, quiet, compliant, blending into the background. She longed to cry out for help but couldn't risk the safety of her daughters. During these years, Jaycee found strength through writing. Garrido provided her with notebooks, perhaps thinking it was harmless. But for Jaycee, those journals became lifelines. In them, she recorded her daily struggles, her love for her daughters, and her quiet determination to survive. She wrote about missing her mother, about wondering if she would ever be found, and about the pain of living in constant fear. Those journals would later become critical evidence of her captivity and a testament to her resilience. By the mid-2000s, Garrido's property had become notorious in the neighborhood. Neighbors noticed tents, tarps, and odd structures in the backyard. They occasionally saw children peeking out, children no one knew Garrido had. Some neighbors called authorities, reporting that Garrido was violating parole conditions and possibly hiding people. Yet, astonishingly, parole officers and sheriff's deputies failed to act decisively. They visited Garrido's home multiple times but never looked closely enough to find Jaycee or her daughters. Each missed opportunity deepened the tragedy. Jaycee was living only feet away from people who could have saved her, yet she remained invisible. Phillip Garrido was skilled at deception. He convinced parole officers he was compliant, neighbors that he was eccentric but harmless, and even tried to portray himself as a devoted husband to Nancy. But inside the backyard, the truth was unchanged. Jaycee was still his prisoner. Her daughters were growing up in captivity. And her family, hundreds of miles away, still prayed for answers. From 2002 to 2008, Garrido perfected his double life. Outwardly, he was a strange but functioning member of society. Inwardly, he was still the same predator, controlling the lives of Jaycee and her daughters. Jaycee, now nearly 30 years old, had spent more than half her life in captivity. Her childhood was gone. Her youth was stolen. But her spirit, though scarred, remained unbroken. She continued to hope, even faintly, that one day the truth would come out. And in the next chapter, that hope would finally be answered. By 2009, Jaycee Lee Dugard had spent more than 18 years in captivity. She was 29 years old, the mother of 2 teenage daughters, and still under the psychological grip of Phillip Garrido. Her daughters had grown up believing the world beyond the backyard was dangerous, that their father's strange religious visions explained everything. Yet they were curious. They wanted to see more of life. They wanted to see more of life. That curiosity would become the crack in Garrido's carefully maintained illusion. Phillip Garrido had become increasingly unstable. His obsession with religion and his delusions about hearing the voice of God pushed him to seek an audience. He began showing up more frequently at the University of California, Berkeley campus, rambling about his supposed mission, trying to hand out pamphlets, and making himself known. In August 2009, he decided to bring Jaycee's 2 daughters with him. To Garrido, it was a way to showcase how he had changed and to present himself as a reformed man with a family. To Jaycee, it was terrifying, but she had no choice but to comply. On August 24, 2009, Phillip arrived at UC Berkeley with the 2 girls, ages 11 and 15. They were dressed modestly, quiet, and noticeably sheltered. Campus police officers Lisa Campbell and Allie Jacobs noticed something unusual about the trio. Garrido was behaving strangely, speaking in disjointed religious ramblings, while the girls seemed timid and disconnected from normal social cues. Jacobs later recalled that the girls' behavior didn't match their age. They avoided eye contact, spoke cautiously, and seemed unfamiliar with basic aspects of the outside world. The officers became suspicious. Something about Garrido didn't add up. They ran a quick background check and discovered his past convictions for kidnapping and rape. Alarm bells went off immediately. The next day, August 25, 2009, Garrido was summoned to his parole office in Concord, California. He arrived with Nancy, the 2 daughters, and a quiet, thin, blonde woman who introduced herself as Alyssa. That woman was Jaycee Lee Dugard, though no one in the room realized it yet. Parole agents and police officers questioned Garrido about the girls. He rambled about being a man of God, about starting a religious ministry, and about his new family. His story made little sense. The officers pressed him. Who was Alyssa? Where had these girls come from? Why had no one ever seen them before? At first, Jaycee played along with Garrido's lies. Years of conditioning had taught her to obey, to keep quiet, to protect her daughters. But as the questioning intensified, something inside her shifted. For 18 years, Jaycee had been silenced. She had lived under threats, fear, and manipulation. But in that parole office, surrounded by officers who weren't going to let Garrido walk away this time, Jaycee did something extraordinary. She quietly revealed her true identity. "I'm Jaycee," she said. "Jaycee Dugard." The room went silent. Some officers didn't immediately believe her. Jaycee had been missing for nearly 2 decades. Could this thin, soft-spoken woman really be the 11-year-old girl who vanished in 1991? But as she spoke more, the details flowed out, her memories, her family, her life before the abduction. There was no doubt. Jaycee Lee Dugard, the girl the world had thought lost forever, was alive. Within hours, Phillip and Nancy Garrido were arrested. They faced charges of kidnapping, rape, false imprisonment, and countless other crimes. News of their arrest spread like wildfire. Reporters swarmed Antioch. Neighbors who had long suspected something was wrong were stunned that the truth had finally come out. Law enforcement scrambled to piece together the unimaginable reality. Jaycee had been living in captivity, raising 2 daughters, in a backyard compound that had been overlooked for 18 years. On August 26, 2009, the story broke publicly. Jaycee Lee Dugard had been found alive. For her mother Terry, the news was overwhelming. After 18 years of praying, hoping, and grieving, she was finally going to see her daughter again. "The nightmare is over," she told reporters, her voice breaking with both relief and disbelief. For the world, Jaycee's escape was both shocking and inspiring. The story dominated headlines, sparking outrage at the failures of the justice system and awe at Jaycee's resilience. The moment Jaycee revealed her identity in the parole office was the turning point, the end of nearly 2 decades of silence and suffering. What had begun with a white sedan on a quiet road in South Lake Tahoe in 1991 ended with a soft but powerful declaration in 2009. "My name is Jaycee." She had survived the unthinkable. She had raised children in captivity. She had endured abuse, fear, and isolation. And yet, she had not been broken. Her escape was more than just freedom. It was a miracle of survival, a moment that would change her life, her family's life, and the way the world looked at missing persons forever. When Jaycee finally walked out of the parole office in August 2009, she was stepping into a world that had moved forward without her. She had last been free in 1991 when George H.W. Bush was president, when payphones lined every corner, and when cassette tapes still filled backpacks. Now, she was entering a society of smartphones, the internet, and 24-hour news cycles. For Jaycee, the transition was disorienting. She had lived almost 2 decades inside a backyard prison, conditioned to obey Garrido's every word. Suddenly, she was surrounded by police officers, social workers, and family she hadn't seen since she was a child. Her first words to her mother were simple but powerful: "Hi, Mom." For Terry, hearing her daughter's voice again was the miracle she had never stopped praying for. Their embrace was filled with 18 years of tears, loss, and unbroken hope. Phillip and Nancy Garrido were quickly indicted on multiple charges: kidnapping, rape, false imprisonment, and abuse. The evidence was overwhelming. Jaycee's testimony, her journals, DNA, and the physical compound in the backyard painted a picture of horror that left no room for defense. In 2011, Phillip Garrido was sentenced to 431 years to life in prison. Nancy received 36 years to life. Neither would ever walk free again. For Jaycee, their sentencing closed the chapter of her captivity, but healing from 18 years of trauma was just beginning. Freedom was both beautiful and frightening. Jaycee had to relearn even the simplest parts of life. How to use a cell phone. How to drive a car. How to walk into a grocery store without fear. How to trust people again. Her daughters, who had never known the outside world, had to adjust even more. They were suddenly enrolled in school, exposed to peers, and faced with the challenge of understanding their past. Counselors, therapists, and specialists worked with the family. But Jaycee's strength was evident. She focused on creating stability for her daughters first, even while she was still healing herself. In 2011, Jaycee released her memoir, A Stolen Life. The book was raw, emotional, and brutally honest. She recounted the details of her abduction, her years in captivity, and the resilience that carried her through. The memoir became a bestseller. Readers around the world were stunned not only by her survival but also by her ability to write with grace, clarity, and hope despite everything she endured. In 2016, she published a second book, Freedom, My Book of Firsts, documenting the struggles and joys of her life after rescue, her firsts as an adult finally experiencing freedom. Jaycee didn't just focus on her own recovery, she turned her pain into purpose. She founded the Jaycee Foundation, dedicated to helping families recover from abduction and trauma. Through her work, she has supported other survivors, raised awareness about systemic failures, and advocated for better training for parole officers, police, and social workers. Jaycee has also spoken about the importance of hope. She often says that even in her darkest days, she never let go of the belief that something could change. That message has inspired countless people worldwide. The systemic failures Jaycee's case forced America to confront uncomfortable truths. Parole officers had visited Garrido's home many times but failed to discover the backyard compound. Neighbors had reported suspicious activity but were ignored. Police departments across counties missed opportunities to connect tips and reports. After her rescue, California conducted reviews of parole procedures. New policies were introduced to ensure parolees with violent pasts were monitored more thoroughly. Jaycee's suffering highlighted how badly the system had failed and how urgently reform was needed. Today, Jaycee is known not only as a survivor but also as a symbol of resilience. She values her privacy, focusing on raising her daughters and living as normal a life as possible. She has spoken publicly at times but remains guarded, not defined by what happened to her, but by how she overcame it. Her ability to find light after nearly 2 decades of darkness continues to inspire millions. In her own words, freedom is not just the absence of chains. It is the ability to choose, to live, to hope, and to dream again. The kidnapping of Jaycee Lee Dugard began as one of the darkest crimes in modern history. But her escape transformed it into one of the greatest stories of survival and hope. From an 11-year-old girl walking to her school bus, to a young mother raising children in captivity, to a survivor standing strong and reclaiming her life. Jaycee's journey reminds the world that even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, the human spirit can endure. Her story is not just about abduction. It is about resilience, justice, and the power of hope. And perhaps most importantly, it is proof that even after 18 stolen years, freedom is still possible. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to support the channel. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Thumbs up, keep liking and sharing the videos you enjoy, it helps us reach more viewers. Stay tuned, because more powerful and inspiring true crime stories are just one click away. Thank you for watching. Folded hands.